Paranoia, superstition, mass hysteria. The Salem witch trials are one of the most chilling episodes of early modern history. Communities torn apart by fear, suspicion, and the pressure to conform. 20 people were executed at Salem, with many others dying in prison. This is a story of just one of the condemned, Elizabeth Howe. I'm telling Elizabeth's story because she was the only victim from Yorkshire. She is also absent from the most famous fictionalised telling of the story, The Crucible. She was born Elizabeth Jackson in around 1637 in the village of Rowley, East Yorkshire. She was only a few years old when her small community was thrown into upheaval. The local preacher, Reverend Ezekiel Rogers, was a Puritan. He'd been ordered to read out from the pulpit the King's Declaration of Sports, a document outlining what activities were allowed on a Sunday. These included archery and dancing, but to Rogers and his strict Puritan faith, this was unacceptable. It profaned the Holy Sabbath. He refused to read it out. For this, he was dismissed from his post. This episode is important because not only is it the event which brought Elizabeth to North America, but it illustrates the religious culture which would arrive in New England. For Rogers, this was the final straw. He decided to follow the example of other Puritans and leave for the New World, where he hoped to live out his faith in peace. 20 families set sail across the ocean. There's an image of the Puritans as fleeing religious persecution, but that's only half the story, because the Puritans themselves would become religious persecutors. Those who stayed in England gained power, and in 1643 ordered that the Declaration of Sports be publicly burnt. Puritanism, as a religious culture, actively rooted out the elements of society which they felt were corrosive. And now they were going to set up their own communities in North America, where, with nobody to stop them, this culture would only become more concentrated. It's often claimed that Elizabeth and her family sailed over on the John of London, the ship which first brought a printing press to the New World. However, the family doesn't appear on the passenger list. Whichever ship they sailed on, what matters is that they arrived in New England, and in 1639, the village of Rowley, Massachusetts, was established. In 1658, Elizabeth married James Howe from the neighbouring village of Ipswich. At this point, the transplanting of names from England to New England is going to get very confusing for British viewers. Here's a map to clear things up. Here is Rowley, here is Ipswich, and here is Salem. There's only about 15 miles between Rowley and Salem, so everything is pretty well connected here. Back to Elizabeth and James. Together they had 6 children. James began to lose his eyesight and eventually became blind. Elizabeth now had to look after her husband, raise 6 children, and manage a 12-acre farm. She would have been an incredibly hard-working woman living through some very difficult times. Life at this time was harsh. For these early settlers, they faced the constant anxiety of knowing that if there was a bad harvest or their animals became sick, they could lose everything. They were at the very edge of the known world. Across the wilderness lived natives who, only 15 years previously, had led a bloody uprising against the settlers. And on top of all that was a constant fear that the devil was prowling around, looking for his next victim. All of this would have generated unimaginable stress and paranoia. The problem started with her neighbours, the Purley family. Ruth Purley and Elizabeth Howe were sisters-in-law, but this did little to strengthen their bonds. In 1682, 10 years before the trials at Salem, the Purleys had fallen out with Elizabeth and James. Shortly afterwards, the Purleys' 10-year-old daughter, Hannah, began suffering fits. She blamed Elizabeth. The parents called several doctors, who declared that she was bewitched. Hannah continued to suffer for a couple of years before dying. Sometime after Hannah's death, Elizabeth wanted to join a church in Ipswich, but Samuel Purley, Hannah's father, prevented it. Elizabeth was, after all, a witch. 10 years later, in 1692, a group of girls in Salem began experiencing strange fits and behaviour. Samuel and Ruth Purley remembered how their daughter had suffered from similar fits. Wasn't she bewitched by Elizabeth Howe? They publicly accused Elizabeth of witchcraft, and she was arrested. The arrest warrant claimed that she had also bewitched some of the girls in Salem. When she was brought into the courtroom for the trial, the girls fell into fits and claimed that Elizabeth had hurt them.
How do you plead to the charges?
The court asked. If it was the last moment I was to live, God knows I am innocent of anything of this nature, she replied. The girls cried out that Elizabeth had hurt them.
What do you say to these things?
Sir, I am not able to give an account of it. It was the truth. Nobody could explain why the girls were acting the way they were, other than being possessed, of course. Mass hysteria? Social pressure? Probably not eating mouldy bread. But this was a kangaroo court.
It is strange that you should do these things and not be able to tell how.
More and more people began coming out of the woodwork with evidence of why Elizabeth was a witch. After Samuel Purley had prevented her from joining the church in Ipswich, his cow had gone mad and died. Her brother-in-law claimed that she had cursed his pig. She was blamed for the fact that too many nails had broken whilst trying to build a fence. Most of the accusations concerned livestock and other practical elements of agricultural life. Living at such a stressful and precarious time, maybe this was a way of externalizing problems. If you lost a cow, you lost a big source of food, income, and materials. Your livelihood was in jeopardy. If you purged the illness from society, maybe things would get better. Maybe things would stop going wrong. But some people did come to her defence. This was an incredibly risky thing to do, because you could lose your reputation and even bring suspicion upon yourself. Her father-in-law testified that she was a loving, dutiful and obedient wife to his son. Reverend Phillips of Rowley also came to her defence. He testified that, with another clergyman, he visited the Purley family when Hannah was having one of her fits.
Mr. Payson and myself went to Samuel Purley to see their young daughter. When we were in the house, the child had one of her fits, but made no mention of Goodwife Howe. When the fit was over and she came to, Goodwife Howe went to the child and took her by the hand and asked her whether she'd ever done her any hurt. And she answered, "No, never. And if I did complain of you in my fits, I know not that I did so." Samuel Purley, brother to the afflicted girl, said, "Say Goodwife Howe is a witch! Say she is a witch!" I rebuked him for his boldness to stir up his sister, as she had cleared Goodwife Howe from doing any hurt in both our hearing. No wonder that the child in her fits did mention Goodwife Howe, when her nearest relations were so frequent in expressing their suspicions in the child's hearing.
Neighbours testified that Elizabeth was faithful, hard-working, and had never said a bad word against her accusers. But nothing could change the minds of the court. There had been too many theatrics. Too many things had gone wrong when Elizabeth was around. Cotton Mather, a prominent Boston clergyman, declared that the trials were the final charge against the devil's legions and that the end of the world was at hand. Purge the demon from society, and society would no longer be afflicted. Elizabeth was hanged on July 19th, 1692, with 4 other accused women. As a convicted witch, she was not allowed a Christian burial, and so was buried with the others in unmarked graves. There's no evidence that Samuel and Ruth Purley ever apologised for their actions, but Thomas Purley, Hannah's brother, was a member of the jury which convicted and executed Rebecca Nurse. In 1697, he signed a document which read,
"We justly fear that we were sadly deluded and mistaken, for which we are much disquieted and distressed in our minds, and do therefore humbly beg forgiveness."
In 1911, Martin Purley, a descendant of the Purleys, wrote a book about Elizabeth's trial. In it, he called the episode a delusion and a hideous monster.
The court was without authority. None of the judges was bred to the law. Evidence was arbitrarily admitted or excluded. The accused were not allowed counsel in law or the consolation of the clergy in religion. At best, the occurrence furnishes the wildest and saddest chapter in our New England history.
Elizabeth Howe was a woman whose only crime was falling out with her neighbours. Falsely accused of bewitching a young girl, she carried that stigma around with her for years before it was dredged up and used against her. A hard-working woman whose neighbours testified to her character, she was cruelly hounded and persecuted by a mob. The lesson we should learn from her story is that we all could fall victim to the whimsies of a mob, and we all should have the courage to stand up against them.